Hi sewing friends, welcome to my sewing room. My name is Beth, and if you're new, welcome. Today I'm adding a binding to this little doll quilt. It's sort of an unconventional way to add binding. I haven't seen it done this way before. I'm using an old quilt as my inspiration for this binding today. I have 4 strips of binding. They are 2 inches wide, and 2 of the strips I'm trimming to be just a tiny bit longer than the 2 sides of my quilt, and the other sides will need to be even just a little bit longer than that. It just depends on how big your quilt is. I'm going to take these strips of binding and I will press in half, and then I will press those 2 raw edges in. I'll fold those inside, so I'll have my raw edges inside ready to go onto this quilt. I'll be attaching my binding to the front of my quilt. I'm going to use those lines that I pressed as my guide. So I'm going to put that binding on the edge of my quilt, and I'll just follow along that first fold or that first press, which is about a ½ inch away from the edge of the quilt. After attaching the 2 sides of the quilt, I'm going to roll that binding around to the back. I need it to be positioned towards the back, and I want to pin it to just hold it there because I need it to be in this position for when I add the next 2 pieces of my binding. So I'll do this on both sides. All right, now I have the other 2 pieces of my binding, and I'm going to let this piece of binding hang off the edge of my quilt about ½ inch to 1 inch. I just need some excess there because I'm going to be adding a seam, and I want to make sure that the back of that first binding is folded over. I'm going to be sewing over that fold, but I'm going to be hand stitching the back, so I'm waiting to do that. So I start right at the top of the quilt, and I'm going to again follow that little fold that I pressed when I got my binding ready. Now that I have the last 2 pieces of binding on, this is probably the trickiest part or the most difficult for me to explain. I am folding the binding sort of backwards, right sides together, but I want those folds in there, and then I'm going to sew right to the right of that first piece of binding that I put on there. I'm going to get as close as I can to that first side of binding and put a tiny stitch. Then I'll be trimming the excess fabric there and turning it right side out. I'll be doing the same thing on all four corners of my quilt. Now this strip of binding there is pretty long, but I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to fold it sort of right sides together or backwards from the way that I pressed it, and I'll try to sew as close as I can to that right side there, and I'll trim and turn it right side out. And then when I get all this binding on, all I need to do is hand stitch around the back. This is a fairly simple way to add binding. It's straightforward. It's not like my typical binding. I am using the method that the quilter used in the quilt that I am copying here in this little doll quilt. If you have seen this method before, I'd be interested to hear about it in the comments. I looked around in some old books and couldn't seem to find this method, but I think it's neat and tidy, and if you don't want to use that long piece of binding and turn the corners there with that long binding that we typically do, this is a great way, a great option. When my binding was all sewn on the front, I rolled everything to the back, covered up all the raw edges and tucked in all those little things that strings that might want to pop out, pinned it in place, and then I just took a needle and thread and worked all around the back of this little doll quilt. This is such a pretty little quilt. I had fun trying to copy that old quilt that we've been working on, and I really enjoy sewing with you. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.